Welcome to this online lesson on the developments of infantry weapons and tactics from around 1650 to around 1800. Today we're asking the question, was this the birth of the modern soldier? Here's a do now task that you can do. Study the two pictures above. How are the two soldiers similarly equipped? What about the soldier's equipment is different? If you want to have a go at that, pause the video now. Right, what did we pick up on? You may have noticed that both soldiers are dressed reasonably similarly with a red jacket. One of them is a new model army musketeer with the first red jacket introduced to British soldiers, and the other is a British light infantry soldier also wearing a red jacket. You'll notice that both of them are armed with firearms. This is another similarity. However, there are several marked differences as well. The soldier on the right, the British light infantry of around 1805, also has a bayonet or knife fitted to the end of his gun. This is something that was lacking to the new model army. You'll notice as well that the new model army soldier has a bandolier of separate bottles of gunpowder around his chest, and the soldier on the right does not have that. Instead, he's got a pouch where his ammunition was kept in cartridges, as we'll see. You've probably noticed other things as well, and if you have, well done. We'll move on now. New development number 1. Flintlocks. A reminder, in the English Civil War, most soldiers were armed with matchlock muskets. The match was unreliable as it could go out, and fiddly because it needed to be blown and refitted with every shot. It was dangerous to carry a burning match near gunpowder, and at night it glowed, making it impossible to hide. That's a matchlock musket there, an early type. This was later replaced by the easier and more reliable flintlock musket. Notice the differences. You can see the flint is the piece of stone held in the clamp. This had a metal cover to stop the priming powder falling out. It also stopped it blowing away in windy weather. A spring-loaded cocking lever held a flint which made a spark when it hit the metal cover. If you've ever been camping and struck a flint against a piece of steel, you'll have seen a similar effect. This meant that the gun could be kept loaded and ready to fire, and it was much safer and quicker to load the gun. I've included in the description of this video a short video of about 2 minutes long showing the loading procedure for a typical Brown Bess musket of this period. Your tasks then. Watch the video first if you think it'd be helpful. Firstly, explain how the flintlock worked. And secondly, explain how the flintlock was better than the matchlock musket. Try and include more than one example of an advantage over the matchlock. If you want to do those tasks, pause the video now. Okay, how did you get on? Well, first of all, you may have identified that the flintlock was more reliable and safer to use than the matchlock musket, because the matchlock musket, for example, could get wet in the weather and not work. Also, the match could set off the gunpowder unexpectedly and inadvertently, which could be dangerous. And you might have also noticed that the matchlock muskets needed to be loaded immediately prior to being fired, and the flintlock musket could be kept loaded more safely and for a longer period of time. There are other advantages as well which you may have picked up on, but we'll move on to the next development now. Cartridges. We have some images of cartridges on the right. A cartridge is a small waxed paper package which includes the gunpowder, the musket ball and the wadding for the musket all in one. Here's how they worked. In the 1700s, a new way of loading the traditional musket was introduced, the cartridge. It consisted of a wax paper carton, pre-measured with the right amount of gunpowder with the bullet in the top. It was used in the following way. 1. Bite the bullet out of the paper cartridge. 2. Pour a small amount of powder into the priming pan. 3. Pour the rest of the powder down the muzzle of the musket. 4. Spit the bullet down the barrel of the gun. 5. Screw up the paper and ram it down the barrel as wadding. Cock the lever and fire. Note as well that this wadding would help scour out the gun of any fouling from the earlier shots that have been taken. Your tasks then, and again it might be useful to re-watch the video or see it for the first time if you've not done so already. Watch the video and then record the loading procedure for a cartridge. Explain why this procedure is quicker than loading using a bottle of powder and a separate ball and wadding. As an extension, how might this invention make it easier to supply ammunition to soldiers? Pause the video now and complete the tasks. Okay, hopefully we've recognised that there are fewer separate operations in this loading procedure with the cartridge than there are we're using different bottles of gunpowder, priming powder, musket balls, separate wadding and so forth as used with the matchlock musket. Not to mention the fact that it's easier to load with the flintlock procedure as well. Also, as an extension how this might make it easier to supply ammunition, bear in mind that it would be easier to keep these separate packages of gunpowder supplied to the troops because they were pre-packaged and pre-measured out. You wouldn't need to be measuring out gunpowder at one point and then issuing musket balls with the potential to imbalance this so that soldiers might run out of gunpowder before they run out of musket balls, for example. Also, the way that these are put together is useful in terms of mass production. Consider that at this time the Industrial Revolution is just starting out, so the principles of mass producing small items like this would be pretty well established. The process of getting one person to roll the paper, another person to fill it with gunpowder, another person to load the musket ball and tie it all up would have made the production of these bullets and these cartridges in their millions really practical for future wars, as was seen during the Napoleonic Wars. Anyway, that's covered how guns have changed in this period. New weaponry development number 3, bayonets. What are the tactics of musket, pikes and cavalry from the English Civil War, and how could these tactics be simplified? If you've not done about the English Civil War, you might want to have a look at my lesson on the New Model Army and about how recruitment changed in the Tudor and Stuart period. If you have, you might recognise that the tactics of musket, pikes and cavalry worked a lot like the game rock, paper, scissors, whereby the muskets beat the pikes because the pikes are so slow, the pikes beat the cavalry because they have such long spears, and the cavalry beat the muskets because they're so fast the muskets don't get a chance to reload. Now, how could these be simplified? Well, if you could combine the strengths of the musket and the pikes together, then there would be no need to have separate troops of this sort. This is what the bayonet set out to do. The bayonet was an invention which allowed musketeers to gain some of the advantages of pikemen. By fitting a blade to the end of the gun, it could function as a gun and a spear, which was useful against both cavalry and in hand-to-hand fighting. The bayonet was developed in the following order. First of all, the plug bayonet. These were first used in the late 1640s. They jammed tightly into the barrel of the gun, but the gun could not be fired with it fitted. And if you think you'd give this a try and you'd get some amusing effect of the bayonet flying out the end, think again. The gun would simply explode in the chamber and probably kill you. Secondly, the ring bayonet. These slotted around the barrel so that the gun could be fired, but it often slipped off. It was fiddly as well. You had to make it the right width so it wasn't too tight and it wasn't too loose. Difficult to achieve. Which leads to the next development. The socket bayonet. Here's a picture of one from a Brown Bess. First used in the 1690s, these fitted below or to the side of the barrel with a locking system to keep it secure. Variants of these are still issued to soldiers today, although admittedly they would look rather different to the spike-type bayonet that we can see on the right. Your tasks then. Firstly, record the different bayonet types. As an extension, explain why the socket is better than the plug. You could also explain why it's better than the ring too. Secondly, explain why the bayonet meant pikemen disappeared from armies in the late 1600s onwards. As an extension, why might bayonets still be used on modern assault rifles today? If you want to complete those tasks, pause the video now. Okay, what did we come up with? You may have recognised that the socket bayonet is better than the plug bayonet because it is both more secure, but also allows the loading and firing of the gun at the same time. Those crucial seconds in slotting down the bayonet may save a soldier's life if he's under real pressure and under attack. Also, the pikemen disappeared because the advantage of the pike was largely being lost as soldiers could arrange themselves in tight formations with bayonets instead. This allowed greater flexibility for commanders on the battlefield rather than having pikemen who might be vulnerable to muskets and muskets who might be vulnerable to cavalry. Lastly, why might bayonets still be used? Well, bayonet charges have been seen in recent conflicts such as the war in Afghanistan. Ultimately, when someone's gun malfunctions or runs out of ammunition, it becomes little more than a heavy club unless you've got another weapon. Also, in terms of house-to-house fighting, It can be found that you are unable to bring your gun to bear and fire it before you have to deal with an enemy. I'm speaking rather euphemistically here because it's a pretty distressing sort of business. Unlike other types of weaponry, bayonets require modern soldiers to close with the enemy and kill them in a very cold-blooded and personal way. Nevertheless, the bayonet is a crucial development in the history of warfare and one that you will need to know about. When you finish with this information, we'll move on. Our next section of new weaponry is all related to the rifle. In the Napoleonic Wars, 1803 to 1815, the vast majority of soldiers used muskets. The British used the Brown Bess musket. This was a design from 1715 and used for 130 years, so it was a pretty successful design. This is what it looked like. It was able to fire about 100 metres. Indeed, the ball would fly a lot further than that, but it didn't have an effective range of any more than that because of its inaccuracy. And that's the next point. It was tremendously inaccurate. It was fitted with a socket-type bayonet, also pictured. It was easy and fairly quick to reload. A trained soldier could reload a Brown Bess musket within around about 20 seconds. But in the late 1700s, the Baker rifle was introduced. This was not the first rifle by any means, but it was one of the early, fairly mass-produced rifles adopted by the British Army. It had spiral grooves in the barrel which made the bullet spin. That itself is the rifling. Modern guns also have these spiral grooves cut into them that the bullet can bite into and that can make it spin. The Baker rifle was, pictured, shorter than the Brown Bess, so it needed a longer and clumsier bayonet, also pictured. It was harder to load, slower to fire, and more expensive to make. There's a couple of reasons for this. First of all, it's harder to load because the bullet needed to fit snugly into the barrel rather than just dropping down easily. That meant it needed to be forced down with the scouring stick. You might notice that the ramrod or scouring stick in the Brown Bess is at least as heavy duty as the Brown Bess one, if not more so, despite having a shorter barrel to shove it down. This also makes it slower to fire. You might only get one shot a minute out of a Baker rifle. It was more expensive to make simply because it needed more standardised tolerances. If the barrel was the wrong size or the rifling was done in the wrong way, the gun would not be accurate and the bullets would not fit down it. And so without doing it properly, it would be a useless weapon. Your task then. Oh, one more thing. It was much more accurate. Riflemen fired at individual targets from 200 metres to even 500 metres range. During the Peninsular War in 1807 was one report of a young private in the Rifle Company shooting a French officer at a range of 600 metres. Now, that might have been a fluke, but for the fact that when that French commander's helper basically went to go and attend to him and attend to his wounds, the rifleman shot his helper with his next shot as well. So it was hardly a fluke. Your task then. Task number 1, explain the advantages of rifles over muskets. And task number 2, explain 1 to 3 reasons why the British Army did not issue more Baker rifles and continued to issue the Brown Bess. Give that some real thought. It might not be as obvious as you might think. If you want to have a go at those tasks, pause the video now. Alright, what sort of things have we come up with? Well, firstly, the advantages of rifles over muskets really relate to their accuracy. If they've got much greater range and much greater accuracy, you can pick off your targets more reliably before they are able to pick you off. In terms of the reasons why the British Army did not adopt it in any greater numbers, though, there are a few things here. Firstly, equipping an entire army with Baker rifles would have been tremendously expensive, and that was not something that the British Army wanted to do. Secondly, the Baker rifle was a much more accurate weapon, which required specialist marksman training for the riflemen who were using it. This would have made the process of training sufficient soldiers very difficult indeed. Okay, we'll move on now. Lastly, we're going to have a look at tactical changes. Line, column, square and skirmish. Let's find out the meaning of these terms. All the new developments in weapons led to changes in tactics. Better training meant that soldiers could quickly change formation too. It's worth bearing in mind that by this period the British had a standing army. This was an army that was training when it wasn't fighting in war. The first formation is line formation. This is a defensive formation. A long line of soldiers, which meant maximum firepower, could be poured on advancing enemies. Fired all at once in volleys, usually only a few ranks deep, which meant that columns that got to the line could punch through. By way of a little bit more of explanation, if you've got, say, a line of 3 soldiers deep, all of them can aim and fire their weapons at the same time. That's what's meant by the term of bringing the maximum guns to bear. However, a column, as we'll see, is a much thinner formation. When a column reaches a line, it can punch through because it's got a far greater weight and depth of men. Next, the square formation. This is another defensive formation. This time, it was a defence against cavalry. Soldiers formed into a square with bayonets fixed and with commanders and wounded men in the middle, where they could be better protected. They could fire in any direction and fend off horses, but this was vulnerable to cannon fire and not effective against infantry. Like a pike block, the defensive infantry square needed to stay very tight indeed in order to ward off the horses and the cavalry. If they loosened up, the cavalry could charge through. Equally though, by the virtue of the fact that they were so tightly packed together, if a cannon was able to fire canister shot or even a solid shot into the midst of the soldiers, then many men could be wounded and killed at any one time. So it had to be used in a careful way. Lastly, the column, an attacking formation. A huge, narrow column of troops that would advance on a line of infantry and punch through with bayonets and sheer weight of numbers. The thing with a column is the people at the front of the column were at the greatest risk. But the idea was that the psychological impact of a column marching towards you without stopping would often be sufficient to make a defending force run away from the battlefield. This was a tactic that Napoleon used to devastating effect several times. Lastly, skirmish. This is a new innovation. Groups of riflemen, not musketeers, riflemen, fought independently and in small groups, moving around and picking off prime targets. They could even move from cover to cover. They could be used to pick off prime targets, but they could be hard to control and keep disciplined once in action. Once they were in skirmish formation, it was difficult to recall them. Your tasks then. Firstly, record relevant details for each formation, perhaps draw a diagram too. If you're struggling with that one, there will be some pictures later in this presentation to help you. Secondly, record the strengths and weaknesses of each formation. What were they designed to do? Why were they good at this? What were they weak against and why? Thirdly, in what way are skirmishing riflemen more like modern soldiers? If you are going to attempt these tasks, pause the video now. Alright, let's see what you got up with. So the line formation has the advantage of being able to bring the maximum guns to bear, but because it's such a thin formation, it is weak against the much deeper column. Similarly, the square is excellent against cavalry, but it's not particularly mobile. It's also tightly packed, which makes it vulnerable to artillery fire. The column is an attacking formation which is very effective at punching through much narrower formations like the line. However, not many soldiers can fire at any one time. The skirmish, on the other hand, is very useful in terms of picking off prime targets, but is not going to turn around an army of many thousands, nor is it easy to control. However, what makes skirmishing riflemen more like modern soldiers is that they do act far more independently, much as modern soldiers do. Sure, they will have to follow orders, and they will be under the command of a section or platoon commander, but even still, they are able to identify prime targets and take them out without just firing when they're told to. So this little bit more of initiative with the skirmishing riflemen is something that is reflected in the modern British Army. When the local battalions and regiments were closed down a few years ago, the British Army's infantry regiments were amalgamated into, you guessed it, the Rifles, and their badge and their broad colour and uniform is still the same as it was back in the 17 and 1800s. We'll move on now to a test of your knowledge on these formations. See if you can identify the following formations. Number 1. Number 2. Number 3. Number 4. Okay, have a go at that. Pause the video, and when you're done, press play. Right, let's have a look at some answers. Number 1 is probably the easiest one. That is indeed line formation. Many soldiers all in a line so that they can all bring their guns to bear. Number 2 is also pretty easy. This is a column. Notice that this is a narrow column of soldiers. This depicts Napoleon's column in Russia during 1812. Number 3 is skirmish. Notice the difference in uniforms. These are reenactors in the uniforms of the 95th Rifles. This was one of the famous and early rifles regiments first used in the Peninsular War. They've got dark green uniforms. This is one of the first uses of camouflage in war. Ordinarily in this period it would be useful for commanders to be able to see where their forces were, hence the bright red uniforms. But at this time, skirmishers coming in would not want to be spotted, and their uniforms reflect this. Lastly, and perhaps one of the more difficult ones given the perspective, is the infantry square. Notice that this square is being viewed from the corner with the bayonets facing out. The flags or colours are kept protected in the middle, as these would be prestige items and primed for capture by an enemy. If you want to know more about how these were used, I've also attached a link in the description to a video from Sharpe's Eagle. This was an ITV drama produced about 20 odd years ago starring Sean Bean. There is a certain amount of violence in this, but it does give a really good impression, considering the budget of the TV production, as to what these formations were like and how they were used. You will see volley fire by a British line of infantry, admittedly much smaller than the real thing would be, against a French column, and you will see the riflemen acting as skirmishers too to capture the French eagle. The only formation that's not visible will be the square, and when we look at the Battle of Waterloo, you get an opportunity to see the squares in action too. Okay, quite a short question this one, and it shouldn't be too challenging. Describe 2 features of how infantry equipment changed between the English Civil War and the 19th century. 4 marks. You should spend no longer than about 6 minutes on this question, although you may well get it done quite a lot quicker than that. I'm not going to tell you how to answer this question, I'm hoping you'll know that by now. We'll have a look at an example answer next. So, get your stopwatches out, and your time starts now. Pause the video. Okay, hopefully you've spent no longer than 5 or 6 minutes on that. Let's have a look at an example answer. Describe 2 features of how infantry equipment changed between the English Civil War and the 19th century. One feature of how infantry equipment changed was the use of cartridge ammunition. That's picked up my first mark because it's one relevant example. This involved the use of mass-produced prepared paper cartridges containing the powder and ball in the same package. That's my extra detail that secures the second mark for the first example. Another feature was the use of bayonets. That's my third mark. These were spikes that could be fitted to the end of a gun to allow a soldier to act like a pikeman and a musketeer. And the extra detail secures me my fourth and final mark. Make any adjustments and improvements that you need to your answer. And when you're done, that is the end of the lesson. That is the end of the video. And I'll say thank you very much for watching. I hope that that's been useful to you. And if it has, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Many thanks and goodbye.